Hi, and thank you so much for having me. I am really excited to be presenting this information to your audience. If you've been a clinician for some time, you've likely come across an individual with histamine intolerance or some of the conditions that go along with it, and you may not have been aware of the right things to do and the things to avoid. So that's what this presentation is all about. It's educating you and giving you the tools on how to recognize the signs and symptoms, the right way of how to address them, and then common pitfalls of what to avoid. Because, even myself having gone through histamine intolerance years ago, when I first started working with individuals, there were lots of things that I wasn't aware of, and different general recommendations that are very popular, but they're not always right for every client. And so we know we always need a very individual approach for our clients. So I'll really be emphasizing that and how to navigate that. So our learning objectives for today, what histamine intolerance really is and how it differs from allergies or MCAS, mast cell activation syndrome, the overlooked symptoms and co-conditions that signal histamine overload, the key labs that will reveal root causes even when histamine tests fall short, how to build protocols that actually work without flaring your clients, real world case studies. So we'll feature two of my previous clients, and then some common mistakes that even seasoned practitioners can make. This is not a diet handout. This is really all about fixing the terrain. So what is histamine intolerance? So histamine is a natural chemical in the body. It's involved in the digestion process within the immune system, and it works as a neurotransmitter. So when we get overloaded with histamine, which can be due to deficiencies in a couple of the enzymes that help break down histamine in the body, gut dysbiosis, there can be some genetics, or just a general high toxin load. All of those are going to contribute to an overflowing histamine bucket, which is just a very common analogy that individuals use to describe what's happening when the body can't get rid of the histamine that it's either overproducing or that the liver can't get rid of. So the main thing that we want to keep in mind here, this is not an allergy. It's a metabolic and immune processing issue, and clients are often testing negative for allergies. The first route that they get sent down, they're going to go to the dermatologist, they're going to get a skin prick test, they're going to get allergy testing, and 9 times out of 10, it's coming up negative. So the key issue is there is a high level of histamine in the body that the body cannot break down fast enough and that the liver cannot excrete properly enough. So the overlooked symptoms and co-conditions that are going to signal histamine intolerance. So when we think about, there's such a wide array of symptoms, and the reason for that is because mast cells are cells within the immune system that they're throughout the entire body, and they interface with our outside world. So we have them in our sinuses, in our eyes, in our entire GI tract, and their job is to alert the immune system when something is there that shouldn't be, and it's going to set off an inflammatory cascading effect. So if the mast cells are overfiring within the brain, we're going to get neurological based symptoms. So that could be migraines, anxiety, insomnia, especially that 1 to 3 a.m., because that's when the liver is doing most of its detox work. We can also wake up with panic, or some recent studies are showing ADHD might be linked to high histamine levels or high glutamate as well. We can get digestive-based symptoms, so bloating, reflux, food reactions, nausea, a wide array of skin symptoms, hives, flushing, eczema, itching, respiratory conditions, so nasal congestion, asthma-like flares, hormonal symptoms, so this is big. PMS, PMDD, estrogen dominance, there's often a histamine component going on there. And then even cardiovascular symptoms. So they might have heart palpitations, POTS, which stands for postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, low blood pressure, or chest tightness. So what makes this really kind of difficult to identify is the symptoms can fluctuate with stress, with women's hormonal fluctuations, because this is primarily affecting women, but it's definitely, I do work with men as well. And then a toxin exposure. So thinking about all the different things that we can get exposed to on a daily basis. So it's not an allergy, but it acts like one. Histamine intolerance is often mistaken for an allergy response, but again, the allergy tests come back negative. So when we're going to break down, okay, what's an allergy? What's histamine intolerance? An allergy is going to present with an IgE-mediated response. It's going to have an immediate onset. We can have swelling, rashes. Of course, we know even anaphylaxis. And then it's going to be recommended to be treated with antihistamines. Histamine intolerance is an enzyme deficiency, which we're going to dive into a little bit deeper later on. You can have a delayed or fluctuating reaction. So sometimes it's 24 hours, sometimes it's 48 hours, sometimes I'm even seeing it like 3 days later. You're going to get a lot of the same symptoms with the external presentation, but then they can also have challenges with mood, anxiety, depression, fatigue, gut dysbiosis. And then, of course, we know it needs a root cause treatment. So practitioners are often missing this because conventional testing shows nothing is wrong, which is something I'm sure we're all familiar with. So it's not an allergy, it's not a sensitivity, and it's not psychosomatic, it's multi-system overload. So when histamine hits the brain, again, keeping in mind histamine is a neurotransmitter. And so its job, we couldn't survive without it. The histamine gets a bad rap in this presentation, but it is essential because we need it to keep awake. We need it to maintain our arousal, our attention. But of course, then when we have too much histamine in the brain, that's when we're going to run into some problems. So that's where we can see the insomnia at this 1 to 3 a time. Don't, if your client isn't presenting with that 1 to 3 a time, don't automatically dismiss it because everybody does have some variability with their circadian rhythm. Panic or anxiety. So they could be waking up with that, or it really could just spur on at any time. Again, thinking about the histamine intolerance bucket, if your bucket's overflowing at, 3 p.m. every day when you're starting to drive into traffic with a lot of pollution, again, that's going to represent the toxicity overflowing histamine bucket. And then again, ADHD or brain fog. So brain fog is a very common symptom. This can also be due to some imbalances with some of the other neurotransmitters, but of course it's going to impair their attention, emotional regulation, and their focus. And so this is where they might get misdiagnosed with some of these other conditions, but really high histamine levels are what's causing that. So the gut histamine axis, so DAO, diamine oxidase, that's one of the main enzymes responsible for breaking down food-based histamine. So when the gut lining is damaged, we're going to have a decrease in that production of DAO or DAO. Histamine clearance from the liver is going to slow down. And then even when they're eating low histamine foods, you've probably heard this very often, even eating low histamine foods, they're still going to trigger their symptoms. And part of that is because histamine, again, is involved in the digestion process. So every time they're eating, their body is still going to be releasing histamine to break down their food. But keeping in mind, the food is a symptom. It is not the problem. The food is not a root cause. And that's why going on a low histamine diet typically is only going to improve things 10 or 20%, sometimes more in individuals who don't have as many root causes, but we cannot get fixated on going on a low histamine diet is just going to fix everything. So when we think about what causes the DAO enzyme to drop, it's going to be anything that's going to impact gut health, which we know is there's a wide array of things. So we're going to end up with SIBO, leaky gut infections, which can be due to gluten exposure, alcohol, NSAIDs, antibiotics, birth control pills, SSRIs. There are other medications, of course, that can also contribute to leaky gut. Mold and mycotoxins are a huge one. And then nutrient depletion. So these specific nutrients are essential for having a healthy amount of the DAO enzyme. So again, histamine overload, it's a sign, it's not a root cause. So we have to think about why is the body overproducing histamine and or why can't it get rid of that histamine? So when I'm thinking about root causes and symptom drivers, I break it up into these 3 categories, and you do have to evaluate for all of them. So when we're thinking about hormonal-based symptoms, again, PMS, PMDD, we'll talk about the connection with histamine and estrogen. Perimenopause, again, there's fluctuating hormones, and we're often going to see some issues with estrogen dominance because of the natural decline of progesterone. Estrogen dominance, but also poor estrogen detoxification. So I am seeing this more and more where I'm expecting to see estrogen dominance on labs and I'm not. And that's how I know that there's an issue with the liver excreting that estrogen properly, likely some genetic mutations and or a consequence of having mold toxicity, which we know is going to negatively impact liver detox. And then if, low progesterone goes hand in hand with that. So when we're thinking about evaluating the immune system, with mast cell activation, that is causing a hyper responsive state within the body. And it's because something is there triggering the mast cells. There is an initial root cause, but what can end up happening is if you don't remove that root cause from the person's body, the immune system is going to keep trying to signal and keep trying to remove that pathogen or virus or whatever that root cause is. It's essentially trying to communicate with you. And this is the concept of cell danger response. So if you've never heard of that, I would encourage you to go look into that. But it's basically where the immune system becomes very hypervigilant. A chronic viral load, so very common to see EBV or some of the other herpes viruses, autoimmune conditions, so a lot of Hashimoto's, but some of the other ones can be sprinkled in there as well. And then rashes or eczema. Thinking about environmental contributors, so mold, mycotoxins, definitely at the top of the list. VOCs, pesticides, herbicides, heavy metals. EMFs is a very big one, so we don't want to overlook that. And then dental infections as well, something I'm always screening for. So we'll talk about how estrogen is going to activate mast cells, mold sensitizes them, and then stress is going to tip the balance, and this is all resulting in overload. So working with these clients, as we know, with most of the clients we work with, it's never going to be one root cause. There's going to be a lot of moving parts here. So when we're thinking about histamine intolerance versus mast cell activation, how can we determine the difference? So if we're looking at the primary issue with what's going on with histamine intolerance, it's an imbalance in your body's ability to break down histamine within the gut. And that other enzyme it's referring to is histamine methyltransferase, which is referring to breaking down histamine in the brain. When we think about the onset, it's going to be gradual and cumulative. The triggers can be high histamine foods, stress. You're going to have some of those other things in there, but really the difference is if somebody notices a significant improvement with controlling for a low histamine diet and maybe getting some other nutrients or supplements on board, it's histamine intolerance. For the individuals who do the low histamine diet, but then they're also trying to do supplements to support that, but they're not really tolerating the supplements and they're not seeing improvements with going on a low histamine diet, it's mast cell activation. The response to taking the DAO enzyme with histamine intolerance is often positive. Somebody with MCAS, they're not really going to notice a difference. If we're going to test those markers, which I'm not a huge fan of, you could test their DAO enzyme. You could have them do some symptom tracking with mast cell activation. You could test their tryptase, their leukotrienes. You could test their plasma histamine levels. The complexity. So histamine intolerance, it's going to be less complex. It's still going to be moderate, but it's not going to be as severe as mast cell activation, where there are multiple systems of the body impacted. And then the treatment approach, we're going to replenish those gut enzymes. We're going to work on leaky gut, which you need to do with mast cell, but there is a whole lot of other work that needs to be done, mast cell stabilizers, immune modulation. And if we are really, just kind of, again, the main points, with somebody with mast cell activation, they're going to react to everything, especially supplements. Sometimes in severe cases, it can even be like sunlight, smells, that type of thing. So again, mast cell activation, they're reacting to everything. So their symptoms are going to be in multiple systems. So they're going to have gut-based symptoms. They're going to have skin flaring. They're going to have neurological symptoms. They could have cardiovascular symptoms. In general, with mast cell, you're going to see dysfunction in 2 or more systems. They will likely react to fermented foods, to foods with salicylates, which are like a plant defense mechanism that's very high in some berries and all of the herbs. And they might be intolerant to sulfur-based foods, so like onions and garlic. Serotypically sensitive to nearly all supplements, and ones that we would think are very benign, like B vitamins or even magnesium, which I'll talk about later on. They cannot tolerate binders, probiotics, even low histamine probiotics, and especially methyl donors. They're often going to present with chronic fatigue, again with POTS, mold toxicity, trauma, or EMF reactivity. The protocols must go low and slow. And when I mean low and slow, I mean low and slow. Sometimes we're starting with sprinkles. Otherwise, you can risk triggering a major regression, which can take a month or a few months sometimes to come out of. So with the conditions that are going to drive histamine overload, these are all the things that we're going to try to check for. So mold and mycotoxins, definitely top of the list. SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, small intestinal fungal overgrowth. Estrogen detoxification. So I didn't just put want to put estrogen dominance, we really want to know how is their liver detoxing. Trauma, vagus nerve dysfunction. This is a really big one that has to be addressed early on. Again, EMFs. Everybody is bathing in EMFs these days. We are literally in millions times higher electromagnetic field exposure than our grandparents were, and it has a significant impact on our cells. Genetic SNPs, so I can't get too much into the genetics today. I do have a free handout. If you go to my Instagram, you can comment the word genes, and you will get sent a link to sign up for that. It is like the around 20 of the most common genetic mutations that I see really impacting whether or not somebody will present with histamine intolerance. And then autoimmune conditions, asthma, and allergies, thinking about the immune system. And I put these off to the side. So dental infections, amalgam fillings, and vaccines. The reason for that is they're very important still to ask about early on, but not everybody is impacted by these. But for the individuals that are, it's typically very significant. And, you know, with the dental infections, with root canals, with silver fillings, I really try to urge them that has to be addressed first, because we can be doing everything right that we want systemically, but if you have root canals, just that, or root canals or silver fillings, they can be triggering the vagus nerve to be in a constant state of fight or flight. And so it's like you could be doing all the nervous system training you want. You could be doing all the great protocols, lymphatic support, castor oil pack. It doesn't matter. So I really try to make sure they are seeking out a holistic dentist and getting the proper dental care. And then vaccines. So even prior to the COVID vaccine, what we know about how traditional vaccines work is they are probing the immune system. They are injecting you with aluminum or mercury and some other chemicals in addition to the virus. And the purpose of that is to stimulate the immune system to then produce that antibody response to that virus. But the problem is they are triggering Th2, part of your immune system, which is the same part of the immune system that is involved in the histamine response. So if you're working with, medical professionals, nurses, and they're like, I have to get flu shots every year. Of course, we have to think about the heavy metal burden, but it's that constant stimulation of that Th2 part of the immune system. And sometimes it just gets to a point where the scale is just tipped and now their immune system is stuck in that state. And now we have to go through and we have to address all of these potential root causes if we want to pull the immune system out of the Th2 back into the Th1 state. So the real question is, what is the supplement that I need to take to lower histamine? You know, it's not all about how do I lower histamine, it's what are the root causes? What's upstream that is keeping histamine levels high and overloaded in my body? So thinking about the hormone histamine feedback loop, so this is talking about the relationship between histamine and estrogen. In short, estrogen can attach to the cell receptors of histamine and vice versa. Histamine can attach to the cell receptors of estrogen. So you have an excess of one, you're going to have an excess of another. And so this is where there's so much overlap with PMS or PMDD, because there is unnaturally high levels of estrogen going on in these women, and then we're going to have high levels of histamine. So, big red flags are a week before, maybe during the ovulation phase, because this is a natural spike that we have with estrogen, and then in their luteal phase, the week before their period, they are going to have way more intense histamine symptoms or insomnia or mood symptoms. And they're probably telling you, I only have 1 or 2 good weeks a month. That's a big red flag that histamine is playing a role in addition to the estrogen dominance that's going on. So estrogen does increase mast cell activation. It causes the body to release more histamine. But on the plus side, progesterone, if we can regulate progesterone, improve progesterone levels, that helps to increase your DAO enzyme. So there is definitely this reciprocal relationship where then if we can work on the estrogen detox, if we can work on the histamine intolerance, that's going to help to bring the progesterone levels in. Okay, so again, with common root causes, what's the mechanism going on between these root causes? So when we think about mold and biotoxins, there is mast cell priming, mast cell activation, there is DAO suppression. With trauma and stress, we have vagus nerve suppression. There is an immune shift going on. With gut pathogens, we're going to be depleting that DAO. We're going to have leaky gut, inflammation, poor bile flow. So I could have like 3 slides just on bile flow. Bile is so important for removing estrogen, for removing mycotoxins, for other environmental toxins, for supporting thyroid function. And so there is a giant overlap between having sluggish bile and having histamine intolerance. Some of the genetics that I see that are impacting somebody's ability to break down histamine. So again, that DAO enzyme, the MTHFR SNP, which gets so much press, but there really are so many other ones too that can impact that. The HMNT, so again, think histamine drainage in the brain, and then COMT. So this is impacting somebody's estrogen detox, but also how they're going to break down some neurotransmitters like dopamine. The hormonal imbalance that we just talked about, environmental toxins, and then the dental piece as well. So again, histamine, there's never just one cause. We really have to be looking at all of these if we want to help them get into remission. So the key labs that are going to reveal the root causes even when testing for histamine falls short. So why I don't test histamine directly, I don't really find it valuable, to be quite honest. I know that your histamine is high. I don't need to confirm it with a lab test. Blood histamine levels, they're really variable. The Dow enzyme tests, they are not accurate of what's actually going on in the gut. And then most histamine intolerance is diagnosed clinically, not via labs. So these are our root cause labs that we want to look for, the stool testing, so we can check for bacterial overgrowth, parasites, secretory IgA, zonulin, looking at that bile flow. So liver enzymes, lipase, steatocrit, different mycotoxin testing we can use, inflammation markers, and then estrogen load. So the functional health panel that Access Med Lab has provided for you, it has all of the blood markers that I like to check for. When we're looking at the blood work, so the basic blood work, of course, we know we want to see CBC, CMP, CRP, ferritin. This is going to give us information about inflammation, detox, and anemia. The nutrient cofactors that we need in order to support the DAO enzyme. The histamine related, so again, if you wanted to test for them, you could test their DAO levels, you could test for histamine, you could test for tryptase. And then for the hormones, definitely want to take a comprehensive look at hormones, estradiol, progesterone, cortisol, and this is going to show, of course, the estrogen load, detox, and stress reactivity. So a more kind of simplistic way of looking and breaking down the testing. So within the blood work, we can use the functional health panel. If you wanted to do things a la carte, that's how I would do it. For gut testing, these are some of the gut tests that I have used. Hormone testing, if you wanted to do a la carte, you could use this panel here. And then for mycotoxin testing, so just a little note on that, with a urine-based test, you're looking at excretion. And so I have worked with many individuals who they've done mycotoxin testing with another practitioner, and it appears that they only have low levels of mycotoxins on their lab. What we have to understand is this test is showing us how is that person's body able to detox at this time. We know somebody with histamine intolerance, they are not detoxing well. That's why they're presenting with these symptoms. So often, 9 times out of 10, we're not going to see high levels. It might say, for the mosaic, it might say 7.5 on the ochratoxin, which is right at the threshold where it's going to start to be labeled high. But what we have to understand is this person's body is in fight or flight, their liver detox pathways are congested, likely their bile is congested, and this is a test of excretion. So it's showing us how well can their body detox. So you have to understand, we're not just testing test results. You have to look at the full picture there. And what you can do, if they're one of those people that are really hard pressed on test results, say, okay, let's get you on a mold protocol. And then in 2-3 months from now, we'll retest you and we'll likely see more mycotoxins coming out. And now it's at higher levels because your body's supported and is detoxing well. So if you know you're working with somebody who's a terrible reactive M-class individual, not detoxing well, I would use the MyMyco lab because this is going to show, is there immune reactivity going on to those mycotoxins, and has there been recent exposure in the past 6 months? So how do the protocols actually work without flaring your clients and preparing their bodies for detox? So thinking about drainage before detox, this is so important. And this is where other protocols really fail. So we have to open drainage pathways before mobilizing toxins. So I think of it as this drainage hierarchy here. And so at the top, for sure, we have to address the nervous system. If you are trying to push somebody to detox and their nervous system is completely dysregulated, they're not going to be successful. You cannot digest your food. You cannot detoxify hormones. Detoxify toxins or balance hormones if your nervous system is in fight or flight. So that has to be addressed. Sometimes that looks like 3 to 6 months of work before they even try supplements. To support the colon, we know constipation is like the #1 enemy as far as detox. They have to be eliminating 1 to 2 times daily. Liver bile flow. So sometimes this is a major reason why somebody is constipated. So those might overlap a bit. Bile is going to move those toxins from the liver to the gut. And then for the lymphatic or skin support, the lymphatic system's main job is moving garbage, waste from the body, and getting rid of that. And then the kidneys play a major role as well, filtering waste through the urine. But we know like mycotoxins and heavy metals are going to go through the kidneys. So if bile is stagnant, toxins are going to recirculate, especially estrogen and mycotoxins. And then, of course, if the nervous system isn't regulated, the body's not going to prioritize detox. So some specific things that I might use to support these pathways. So as far as the colon, magnesium oxide, I did not put citrate there for a reason. These sensitive individuals sometimes don't do well with that. So oxide is the safer choice. Triphala or some other herbal laxatives. Again, the use here is short term. So sometimes I'll use this and then I'll get on some additional bile support if they've never tried magnesium. If they have tried magnesium though, or some of these other herbs and like, it just doesn't do anything to me, I'm like, this is a bile problem. So then I'm going to go through and trial bile, depending on how sensitive they are, it's going to dictate what I'm going to choose. So dandelion root tea, it's going to be better for your really sensitive individuals. Taurine, we're taking it up a notch. Bitters, up a little higher. Phosphatidylcholine. TUDCA is very strong. Bile acids are very strong. So somebody without a gallbladder, they will likely need a lot of support. Sometimes they don't tolerate it as well. So lots of nuance there. But with any of these, we're going to start low and slow. So never starting with the recommended dose that you're seeing on the bottle. I always start with like a quarter of the dose, especially if they are super sensitive. So binders, we're not going to add until we've adjusted the constipation. But if they're regular, then we can trial activated charcoal, potentially chlorella, zeolite, pectin fiber. It really just depends on the client, on the toxin we're looking to mobilize. Lymphatic system, so rebounding, castor oil packs, dry brushing. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. And then, of course, nervous system work. So every client, it says mandatory for sensitive clients. It's really mandatory for every client because we're all just living in this really kind of fight or flight, stressful world. So, it doesn't necessarily need to look exactly like these recommendations here. What I tell them is whatever it is that brings you joy, that helps your body get into that flow state, I want you doing that at least once or twice a day. So as we know, constipation is the #1 warning sign that needs to be addressed and monitored throughout. So if this occurs, you have to immediately stop binders, immediately stop any of your killing herbs or antifungal agents until that symptom is resolved. So thinking about histamine stabilizing supplements, so you can think of this as like a tiered framework, and I do have some additional handouts that will be available via my email list, kind of diving into this a little bit deeper. So foundational supports, omega-3, as we know, are really, of course, anti-inflammatory, can be helpful for some of these clients. Magnesium malate, so I did not put magnesium glycinate there for a reason. Magnesium malate is the better choice for sensitive individuals. Sometimes there are genetic mutations where their body cannot properly break down that glycine and can cause like a hypersensitive, hyperreactive response. Liposomal vitamin C or food-based vitamin C like camu, and then holy basil is a really nice, gentle one. Maybe just holy basil tea to start. Lemon balm, fresh ginger tea is great too. It's getting into things a little bit stronger. So quercetin could be used, but I am very cautious with quercetin. If you've looked into histamine intolerance at all, you're going to see that's the #1 thing that's recommended, but definitely not for somebody who's anemic because it chelates iron. And I would not use it with somebody with a COMT gene mutation. And so this is really where understanding the genetic piece, I think, is really important. I used to ignore it early on, and it's going to cut through the guesswork. So Yeah, if you are suspecting that somebody has issues with estrogen detoxification, I would probably avoid quercetin. Luteolin is another one, Dow enzymes, of course. Stinging nettle, PEA is a great one too. So more advanced, once we're getting them into a protocol, that this is when I might use something like this. But again, knowing the genetics is going to be key in knowing if these are appropriate for somebody or not. So nervous system regulation tools, again, this is the most overlooked part of it, but it's really one of the most important things. So there are different vagal toning exercises or devices. There's lots of gadgets out there, which are great. Just a word of caution, I would not follow the directions on there because sometimes it'll say, use this for 8 hours as a vagus nerve stimulating device. That could cause somebody to herx. So we want to, every intervention you use with these clients needs to be low and slow. So somatic practices, this can help to release stored trauma, all different types of breath work, and then morning light, circadian rhythm, grounding. So super important incorporating these practices early on to help balance cortisol, to help balance blood sugar. We know that there is a huge connection between high insulin levels and high histamine. So if we can regulate blood sugar and regulate insulin, we can help to lower histamine levels. So getting into the case studies. So the first client, she is a 33-year-old woman. She had sudden, unexplained full body hives, severe facial swelling, and severe lip swelling. She did have a history of black mold exposure. She wasn't living there anymore. She was told to take Allegra, Zyrtec, and Xolair. This is very common. She did have migraines and constipation before every period. But she still was an active person. She's a mom of 2 young girls. She liked to work out and go for runs. So when we looked at her labs, I saw high cortisol. So I'm thinking, okay, is this stress related? Is this due to hidden infections and pathogens? She had low estrogen, low free T3. And so with her having low estrogen, but having some of those estrogen dominant symptoms, it was telling me that she was a poor detoxer. And we did end up uncovering MTHFR gene mutation among a few others. She, again, high homocysteine, so this was a big tell that she had some genetic SNPs going on with her methylation. She had high eosinophils and lymphocytes, so the immune system was under stress. We saw elevated glucose, which of course is going to go hand in hand with that adrenal stress. She had very low ferritin, low iron, low B12, low vitamin D. So this is like a very common kind of cluster of biomarkers that you might see with some of these individuals. And she did have high mycotoxins. She had high ochratoxin and citrinin. And then there was also high levels of yeast, oxalates, and some bacterial dysbiosis. So looking at her root causes and then the interventions that we did, so we knew about the mold exposure. So they did find a little bit of mold in their bedroom. So they remediated that. And then we also mycotoxin test her. Again, with the low estrogen, but the poor estrogen detox, I knew that we needed to get support on board for that because it's not only going to support estrogen detox, but it's going to support mycotoxin detox as well. So we use broccoli sprout, B vitamins, and magnesium. In her case, she was able to tolerate low dose methylated vitamins after a couple months of starting the protocol. She did have severe gut reactivity, so we put her on a mold safe diet. We used some herbal antifungals, some binders, and bile support. And to help with the chronic fight or flight, she really did everything she could to rebalance her circadian rhythm. So she adjusted her workout schedule. She was no longer having coffee and working out fasted. And she toned down the high intensity exercise. So she didn't need more antimicrobials. She needed drainage and regulation first. Some of the, follow-up of what we saw with her. So month 3, she didn't report any hives, which previously they had been going on for months and they were constant. She did have some hives return around month 4 when we increased the detox support. I will say this is common and not to be alarmed if you see it. It's just a sign that the liver needs a little bit of time to catch up. So titrate back a little bit, see if there's other drainage support that you need to add in, and then continue on. So by month 5, she was hive free and they did not return. This was over 3 years ago. She's never had hives since. She eats a varied diet. She doesn't need to eat a low histamine diet, and she's very active. She only takes some basic supplements, B vitamins, minerals, and then occasional herbs for keeping cortisol balanced. Okay, case study number 2. So she was a 31-year-old woman. She had sudden unexplained full body hives, edema, fatigue, severe constipation, severe. She had weight gain and PMS. So we discovered she had mold exposure at home. And then months into her protocol, we realized she was getting exposed at work as well. She was on monthly Xolair shots and also other medications. And then she was recently diagnosed with Graves, which progressed to Hashimoto's, but we'll uncover what happened with that. So when I looked at her labs, she did have high estrogen. She had estrogen dominance, low testosterone. So of course, this was contributing to the fatigue. She had low TSH, very high T3. And so what had happened, she was working with either an endocrinologist or some type of specialist who had her on not just thyroid medication, but they had also recommended she take a natural supplement to support thyroid. And they were not doing a full thyroid panel on her. They were doing TSH and T4. And so we ran a full thyroid panel on her, and her total T3 was astronomically high. She had very high TSI antibodies. And so it had pushed her into Graves. She had high cortisol, so she was stuck in that sympathetic overdrive, high ferritin, and indicating inflammation levels. And then she had very high mycophenolaic acid. I will say you cannot use the mycotoxin test as a way to determine if they're getting exposed to mold or not. Clients want to know that. The answer is no. Mycophenolaic acid, when it's very elevated, it can indicate that there's likely an ongoing exposure, because this is a chemical that gets excreted in 4 to 6 weeks generally. Through like the bile. So if I do see that's very high, then I am very, very suspicious, and I do encourage them, you have to get some testing done. She did have other high mycotoxins as well. So, mold was her biggest root cause by far. So she did the mold remediation at home and mycotoxin testing. And then of course, when we uncovered what was going on at her work, she ended up leaving that place of work. For the high estrogen and the poor estrogen detox, she was put on broccoli sprout and calcium D-glucarate. Because she had severe constipation, she needed extensive bile support. She needed everything. So she needed to be on a full dose of bitters every day, bile acids, phosphatidylcholine, and then still making sure she ate bitter foods. And thinking about, the estrogen, the mold, the thyroid, all of that depends on bile. So there is such an overlap there. To support the thyroid autoimmunity, we had her on olive leaf extract, selenium, and skullcap. So again, it's not like she needed a, bigger, stronger protocol. She needed the right drainage support and regulation support and removing herself from that moldy environment. So by month 6, she didn't report any hives, and they were previously constant, or they would flare up at ovulation or her luteal phase. She did have some hives return around month 8, and this is when we realized she was getting exposed at work. This was also the same time that her endocrinologist had her on the medication and the supplement that drove her to Graves. So we restarted her on the mold protocol while adding in the autoimmune and the viral support. And then with another 4 to 5 months, she was hive free. Her antibodies were coming down. Although her thyroid had moved into Hashimoto's, we were still seeing some gradual improvements with that, and she was continuing to work on the mold protocol, balancing the immune system and weaning off of medication. So what made these cases successful wasn't the supplements, it was the strategy and the order that they were introduced. So common pitfalls to avoid: over-relying on a low histamine diet. This is not the end-all be-all. It is like one tiny part of the picture. There's no such thing as going too low or slow, always only working with one supplement and microdosing. Do not use methylated vitamins early on. They will cause a flare, even when you know they're needed. Not addressing pathogens in the correct order. So in general, for most people, this is the order that I will do: is mold, gut, parasites, and then hormone support. Pushing detox too early. So binders when constipated, a lot of herbal supplements, or even just using the general things that everybody hypes up, like glutamine or colostrum's getting a lot of press. Like, I don't use trendy supplements with these clients. not including the vagus nerve support or circadian rhythm balance, blood sugar balance. And then, if we're not really emphasizing that they need to have a safe home space, sleep space, workspace, they're putting them at risk for getting exposed to these toxins or EMFs. So what to do when nothing works? Go back, focus on the nervous system. That might take 3 months. It might take up to 6 months. Assess for the environment. So I'm not a fan of plate testing. Sure, the ERMI can be great or the dust test can be great. But if we're dealing with somebody who has chronic conditions, they just have to get a reliable mold inspector in there. We could be missing out on some viruses, so checking for that. And again, keeping in mind, we're going to microdose according to that hierarchy of drainage. So this is really where a layered protocol and consults can help support you in this situation. So how I support practitioners like you, I do offer one-to-one consultations if you are dealing with an individual with histamine intolerance and you're just feeling stuck. So I can help you interpret their labs, create comprehensive step-by-step protocols. So you're going to avoid those pitfalls that we just mentioned, and then I'll help you piece together all of the connections on what's going on with their different systems. So if you are interested in getting some free material from me, I do have a 4-stage protocol roadmap, a lab ladder root cause testing strategy, and then MCAS protocol stacking map. So this is really giving you some step-by-step recommendations on, what to look for these individuals as far as testing, and then how to start working them through some gentle protocols. If you do want to sign up for consultations, you will also get some additional support from me. So a supplement reaction decoder. So essentially they react to a supplement and you're like, oh my goodness, I have no idea why that happened. So I can help explain why that may have happened. A low histamine and mold safe diet to use with clients, and then a clinical terrain review checklist. So some of those main root causes that we're checking for, just a checklist to go through. So if you are ready to partner on complex cases, you can click here to book. You can also just shoot me an email or DM me. My email is revivewithheather@gmail.com. On Instagram, I am revive_with_Heather. And I will also be giving out some other information on my email list that I wasn't able to cover here. So diving a little bit deeper into the genetics, and again, you can get my genetic handout. How I'm using peptides to help stabilize sensitive clients, especially early on when it seems like everything else isn't working, and my favorite supplement brands that I use with clients, and then some of the top 5 or 6 supplements that I avoid that are commonly recommended. Okay. And I know Access MedLab, they are offering this wonderful health panel for you to use with your clients. And so these are all the biomarkers that I will use with individuals when trying to assess their root causes. So thank you so much for having me. Again, if you need to contact me, you can do that at revivewithheather@gmail.com.